It's fair to say that the aviation industry is in absolute turmoil. We have 65 million people whose jobs are at stake, and a GDP contribution between travel and tourism that probably extends to maybe 330 million jobs and a gross domestic product output of about 10.3%. The world is facing a very uncertain future.
What we've seen is obviously the fall off in commercial aviation. I think it's about 94% from a program that I work with. But what we did see was an increase in participation in private aviation. And I think what that tells us is that people are putting trust in business aviation. So I think we need to take that trust and expand it to, global emissions too, and climate change and safety.
The area where we will see the first changes will most likely be business aviation, because we look at aircraft that fly short range, small group of people, stay on the ground for a longer time between flights. Business aviation wants to change and can change. And that's the exciting bit of the whole environmental discussion.
I think people are appreciating that we do need aviation. We've seen that in the last few weeks in bringing supplies and people being away from their family. And we've also seen the fact that we don't actually need to fly as much as we do. People have survived without flying.
How do you reconcile bringing jobs back and protecting employment versus the environment?
To reach the goals we need to reach, there's pillars. We need to become more efficient, better technologies, offsets bridging the gap. But what we'll see is efficiencies. When people are tight, what do they start to look for? Ways to burn less fuel, ways to create lighter aircraft so shipping's less to create those aircraft. There's all these different pieces that start to come together, and what we'll start to see is innovation in travel that will reduce emissions on the efficiency side and will invent better technologies.
I think what governments need to realize that there is no short term anymore when it comes to climate policy. We wasted our short term in the 90s and the noughties when we could have taken greater action. We have 10 years to reduce our emissions by 50%. So we've got to make the right decisions now. And that means not wasting any more time discussing baselines in ICAO or discussing different types of offsetting. We need to make the right decisions around investing in new fuels and in alternatives to flying where they exist. That's where the urgency and the effort needs to go. And that can create jobs.
There was something in the order of 14 million minutes of wasted time where we've had an aircraft in the air circling around, waiting to land.
Yep.
If you put that into context and do the math, it's nearly 9,000 days. And every time that happens, we've got emissions that are just spewing out. Yep. So fundamentally, when we think about how do we drive that change, the question in my mind comes back down to, if SAF is to play a part, what can governments do to help encourage that?
Firstly, there needs to be a stable enough market that investors are going to be willing to part with their capital to get these projects over the line, whether that is carbon pricing, an obligation on fuel suppliers to present a percentage of SAF fuel in their fossil mix. There'll be further support required in the near term for feasibility studies and for the initial capital expenditure. And I suppose the third kind of key pillar, these SAF plants are going to have to be built with carbon capture and storage. So the rollout of CCS infrastructure is going to be vital during the later part of the 2020s and into the 2030s to get these SAF plants built and capturing about half the carbon that doesn't make it into the actual jet fuel.
Essentially, we don't have an alternative fuel market at the moment, apart from a few small projects, which are growing in number. But we need to scale it up rapidly. And it's about certainty for investors. It's about creating the supply side of things, so putting money into developing these fuels. And it's on the demand side of things. You want to make sure that these fuels will be used if they're produced. And I think mandates have proven the most effective way of ensuring demand in the future. So a lot more needs to be done by government.
We want to move it forward. And it's a supply-demand kind of situation where now we need to be able that there will be people able to produce it. Not as a final solution, but it's the best interim solution we can come up with.
It isn't really available today in any meaningful quantity. Where it's going to be produced will require it to be shipped, and that in itself is going to carry a carbon footprint. Don't we need effective labeling today to be able to determine that when you buy that gallon of fuel, you really do know what it costs to produce, not just what it emits once it's being burnt at 38,000 feet. We either need to see SAF come down in price, or we need to see some form of redressing the balance, which for many, it would be some form of tax.
Climate change as a risk is accelerating. And I think what surprised me working for an NGO during this crisis is previously, yes, we have seen governments retreat during periods of economic catastrophe. But actually, on this occasion, they're doubling down. Most of them are doubling down on climate issues. We can try and divine what demand is going to be in 5 or 10 years. But so long as the sector is still burning fossil fuel, it's going to have a major problem, and it can't afford any delay in addressing that.
The opportunities are slightly more midterm, but you have investment in the first large-scale sustainable aviation fuel plants that could be developed. Further R&D and demonstrations of electric hybrid aircraft. And we've also just this week had £100 million in the UK announced for development of direct air capture. So that would be a greenhouse gas removal technology to start drawing down the residual emissions from high-emitting sectors like aviation.
I think it's a combination of getting the consumer to feel like it's important enough. At the same time, we've got to be able to create the framework for industry. Do we wait for governments? Do we wait for industry bodies to do it on its own? Or do we start to bring the private sector into play here?
We do need that kind of regulatory certainty you talk about, because companies aren't going to design new aircraft or build new refineries on the back of what could be short-term pledges made by one CEO who could be out in 6 months' time. These are 10, 15-year investments, and industry can provide the innovation, but states can provide the certainty and the framework and make sure that innovation is rewarded.
If we are collecting funding, how do you ensure it gets channeled into the right areas? I'm as guilty as the next person to the extent that I do fly and I have carbon emissions, but I offset them. And that was something that we did with Victor, a year ago to the day. But the question is, where does that money go and how do you make sure it goes into the right hands?
The evolution that I've seen is I have partners who have gone, now they want to go to the next step. They actually want to develop projects, brand new projects, renewable projects. These are the same people who are putting the solar panels on their factories and looking for those next steps and those efficiencies in their homes. The person who's offsetting is also the person who's interested in being innovative and making sure we continue in that direction. And when you talk about a carbon tax and where the money goes, there is that concern for aviation. And I think the goals we want to make sure is that we go towards aviation-centric projects. The offset is a bridge to development. And you have to remember, it's not just a metric ton of carbon. There's something on the ground that's reducing emissions, helping people, helping communities, growing renewables. And that's what you have to remember. A carbon credit is not just purchasing a commodity to walk away and say, I did good.
We also need to see a shift over time, and it's probably going to be during late 2020s into the 2030s where we see more of these carbon credits become a verifiable removal from the atmosphere, whether that's use of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, say to make jet fuel, or whether it's just direct air capture of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Those are the projects that we have both greater certainty over the kind of the amount of carbon being taken out of the atmosphere, and in some of those cases, greater certainty about the permanent removal of CO2.
I certainly feel, in my role as a private jet company boss and environmentalist, I'm constantly struggling with how do I address this conflict that we need to get the world spinning again. We have to fly, but at the end of the day, we've also got to come back and do this in a much more responsible manner, where we get the engagement of the public and we get the engagement of the industry. Perhaps we should start not by talking about the efficiency gains, which might be marginal on the next generation engine, but we should be talking about who's flying, how many times, what is the output, publishing that for every operator, every airline, every person, and that will put the spotlight on it. I can tell you that, to date, since starting our campaign, I think we've offset 42,000 tons of carbon. We're happy to publish the number of flights that we've done, the amount of carbon, obviously, that we've created. Understanding the extent of the problem and shining the spotlight on the protagonists, then we can start to do something about it. But I mean, we could go on. We could look at the labeling around carbon offsets. We could look at the efficacy of carbon offsetting. We could even look at the price of carbon offsets, and that in itself is probably an opportunity for a whole new panel discussion. But I know that we're running out of time. We have run out of time. So thank you very much, everyone.